Welcome. My name is Jason Wynn. I'm an architect, planner, and researcher here in Famagusta, Cyprus, and I work for AlphaTerra Incorporated of Texas. Today, I want to share with you my passion for narrative infrastructure. In 2017, two researchers in Australia were following a songline of stories told to them by one of the navigators of Australia. The people of Australia were pre-industrial for several thousand generations, but they used to navigate their way across the Australian continent by telling stories or songlines. A songline includes the landscape as the characters in the story, and they would repeat the stories to each generation to learn how to navigate their way across Australia. As these researchers were following the songline, it suddenly ended in the seashore. They had no idea what had happened. They presumed they took a wrong turn. After talking about it with some of their colleagues back at the university, one of them asked, "Well, what actually is out beyond the seashore?" And they talked to a geologist, and they artificially lowered the sea level, and they found the rest of the story. They went back to the geologist and said, "When was the last time this land was exposed?" And he said, "Oh, that was towards the end of the Pleistocene glaciation, the last ice age, 13,500 years ago." And these researchers realized that they were following a story that was cartographically accurate, that was at least 450 generations old, that had been handed down from one person to another, from lip to ear, since the start of the agricultural revolution. An ancient infrastructure of stories mapping Australia. On the other side of the world is Famagusta, Cyprus, half of which is a medieval walled city built by the Venetians and the French, and the other half is a modern city, but a modern city in ruins since the 1974 attempted revolution in Cyprus. That conflict was a tragic story of a divided people in conflict, and this is the case study used to develop narrative infrastructure here in the walled city. So what are our objectives for today? How can a narrative infrastructure prepare our communities for things like conflict, disaster, or just manage going forward in a more meaningful way? We're going to cover the basic theory of narrative, show how we can demonstrate narratives on the landscape, and lastly, how to leverage community narratives to guide urban change. We'll talk about storytelling as a planning tool, map stories for legacy public engagement, and proposing new narratives by blending the existing narratives already present. By the end of this presentation, you'll understand the structure of a story and its rhetoric and learn why there are fundamental planning tools. I'll show you how to map stories to create legacy public engagement tools useful for your practice in non-governmental organizations or development or even just policy making, and how to tell stories by blending those existing stories and turning them into competing narratives from tragedy into comedy. Old city urban form is largely built of thousands of iterations of trial and error, resulting in a well-woven fabric designed by the inhabitants. How did they make those decisions? How did they make any decisions? Well, you have to be able to tell the story. A sentence is composed of a noun, a verb, and often a location or an implied location, all culminating in something that is meaningful. A story is composed of the actors in action and the setting culminating in a theme. This is not an accident. We think in stories. Our minds are wired to appreciate story structure, reasoning that cultivates and culminates in meaning. Stories are the foundation of how we learn, love, entertain, and how we come to agreements to work together. A lauded researcher in the field of artificial intelligence, Roger Schenck, found 5 story types that underpin intelligence. First is the official stories that tend to be focused on societal control, like laws. The second would be the invented or adapted stories that are inherently meant to entertain and are derived from historical stories. For example, yarns or anecdotes. The third type is the first-hand stories recounted by witnesses, and this is what we would call testimony or oral history. The fourth type are second-hand stories that are heard about from others. These are we typically refer to as rumors. And lastly, there are the culturally common stories, also known as ossified stories, which are evolutions of narratives told ritualistically. These are classified as the fairy tales and folklore. These are not your film school story tropes. These are the ways cultures use stories and to create and tell their stories, you need to understand the role your story plays in the culture. To build a story, you need to identify the narrative components within your story. First is the setting or the context. This can include the physical and legal domains consequential to the problem in the plot. Second is the characters, the victims, those harmed, the villain, and the villains, those who perpetuate the harm, and their hero who will stop the harm. Third is the plot that includes the temporal element, the beginning, the middle, and the end, providing both the relationships between the setting and the characters, structuring the causal mechanisms, and assigning blame to the villain. The fourth and last is the moral of the story and the lesson learned. For the setting to be rich and convincing, it needs to have sensory cues, like mentioning smells, or describe the taste of the food, or that the characters are encountering noises on the street, and so on. This is being transportive by using imagined sensory engagement, using the memories of the audience to engage more of their brain while engaging you with their story. To tell or write a persuasive story in public, actors, including yourself as the storyteller, should use Aristotle's rhetorical framework of persuasion. This is composed of 4 parts. The ethos of the argument is when the actor speaks with personal experience or recognized authority. The logos is the flow of the logic, the facts, and the data that support the argument. The pathos is the speaker's emotional commitment to their argument. Are they passionate? And the kairos points to the stories that are poignant, the timelessness of the story from the audience's perspective. For the plot to have impact, each actor must have to have a risk of suffering or a loss that the audience must say to themselves, "Oh yes, I wouldn't like that either." The meaning of the story, the theme, is best if only implied by the actors and is the result of the action. When a theme is stated too forcefully, it feels like propaganda, and how the audience interprets the action is out of your control. But if they are transported by sensory cues and feel kinship with the actors and care about the suffering in the plot, they will come to what is meaningful to them. In the act of telling a story, you have 3 components. You have the teller, who you are, where you come from, and why you should be telling this story. There's the narrative itself, which is the setting and the characters and the action and the moral as discussed. And then there's the audience, their prior expectations, what they already know, to what they will already comparing your story to. Mixing these 3 components constitutes the storytelling experience. Speak to each. Discuss how this impacts yourself. Make it personal. Speak or write directly to the audience by name, couched in an empathy for them. Tell of the flaws and the struggles of the characters in their setting, in that action. Now, some things you can practice in order to make this useful to yourself. Examine any point of contention for the characters, the heroes, the villains, and the victims, the plot, the setting, and the theme. Map these out in your mind or on a piece of paper. Always seek the theme of the story and the lesson learned, and restate the story in your own words ending on that theme. The theme should be the mean of all that is above. Hence, it is meaningful. You could also try and make a table of an issue with the stakeholders across the top and the rhetorical persuasion methods from Aristotle down the side. Note the approach of each stakeholder and look for over and under emphasis of those themes from Aristotle. Using a different color, add the additional points the stakeholder could use to make a more rounded argument. You could practice this on something as simple as a television show or a movie or a book. A more organized way to do this is to compose stories on note cards, with 1 card for each of the main characters, and 1 for you and 1 for the audience. Make the cards for each scene in your story. You could even include a little cartoon sketch of the action. This helps you to remember it very well. And if there's time to practice on family or on a friendly audience, take that time. Traditionally, we study theories of the evolution of urban form as if the city planning has always been a profession. However, In the first 495 generations of city building, the vast majority of the results of these are incremental, not grand designs. Prior to the problems of the Industrial Revolution, cities normally evolved with the constant churn of loosely related small decisions that bettered the immediate lifestyle of the inhabitants, generation after generation. Thousands and one stories interfering with one another. By leveraging a community's stories, you make the themes of their lives meaningful to the planning process. They strongly desire this. They want their lives to be important to shaping their environment. Use their stories to plan, and you will more likely have their support. So how do you map stories for legacy public engagement? Well, this has got two parts. There's the coding, and then there's the mapping. Each narrative snippet, when you have actually looked at something that someone has told you about a story that they have told you, will have some kind of a theme or a setting. The setting gives you a latitude and a longitude. I'll talk more about that later. The theme of a story is its code. You can choose codes as you see fit, but a useful a priori code set that is applicable to most stories is derived from the political thinker Hannah Arendt and her book The Human Condition. Arendt proposed three primary codes of urban life based on how ancient Athens was organized into three main classes: the laborers, the workers, and the actors. Now, the laborer is someone who primarily focused on the labors that produce the consumable goods and services of our daily lives. This includes such things as the cooked food, the cleaning, children or childcare, mindfulness, meditation, therapy, medicine, or hospice. The characteristic emotion associated with labor is subjective well-being or happiness. It's the pleasure taken from things we consume that keeps us alive. Works are the durable items that are intended to survive ordinary daily use. These are the kinds of things like the core infrastructure of our cities, buildings, and the tools that we use to make them. Works of art are also included, like literature and even legislation. The characteristic emotion associated with work is satisfaction, extending the abilities for greater life achievement or enjoyment beyond basic needs. Actors. Whether direct action or more typically speech that motivates others into action is in order to change something about our civil relations, and this is the definition of an actor. These includes politics, conflicts including wars, protests, critical discourse, or extending aid to others. The characteristic emotion associated with action is in fact joy. It's the slightly euphoric state of a group working together, the esprit de corps. Now, these next three codes are derived from the first three. This is not original to Arendt's discussion, but it is well encapsulated in her work. The first of these is domain. This is the particular part of a context that's directly relevant to the stakeholders or the people in the story. This includes their places of regular worship, their home, and their employment, or, on larger timescales, locations of events that are used regularly by the group or for personal cultural issues. The characteristic emotion that is associated with domain is safety. Identity is the total things, places, and groups we wish others to associate with ourselves beyond our physical body. This includes such things as social clubs or political parties, ideologies, social media activity, our ethnicity, media figures, aspirations, opinions expressed for the sake of solidarity, and fashion, and all things related to self-expression in groups. The characteristic emotion associated with identity is belonging, the outward claims of selfness and credentials of different group memberships. And lastly, meaning. Meaning is anything or idea that demonstrates the relationship between impactful life situations or circumstances. This can include the themes of narratives, the lessons learned, the reason to establish a law based on the arguments presented in an action, contemplative meditation, critical thinking done alone, or the catalysts or causal agents. And, of course, the ideas that establish a sense of continuity within any venue. The characteristic emotion associated with meaning is that of understanding or wisdom. Assigning the correct code requires judgment and practice, and you can practice coding on your own by reading or with television characters' motivations or interpersonal interactions. The more you practice, the more second nature it will be to see a code manifesting in the moment. When making a professional effort to code a meeting or a public story, it is strongly suggested to have two coders independently code the same data points and compare results. Debate those discrepancies. If any story lends itself to two codes, keep both, but choose a dominant code that explains the next scene in the story. Mapping of coded narrative snippets involves locating the central setting of the snippet, then assigning a polygon based on the pedestrian transportation network. The polygon will include a surface area of 220 meters in all directions and a 10 meter to either side for visual range. Now, software like ArcGIS includes a surface area plugin that accomplishes this with ease. The distance was established based on the neurological science of memory and the typical visual acuity range of a walking speed of an elderly adult. Stakeholder. Things you might practice this method on? In a meeting, both within and beyond the office, make a simple circle with 6 pie divisions and put a dot in the pie wedge for each code that you hear in someone else's conversation. Occasionally assess what isn't being said and explicitly raise that subject as a question to provide a well-rounded conversation. If everyone is talking about a development and how it will bring stronger industry while reinforcing the identity, but no one is mentioning the service industries that will need the labor at that new development, ask, how is this going to be wonderful for the janitors and the cooks, for childcare? On even formal guides or policies, you can include a handful of one-paragraph stories of those affected, even if you're only doing this for yourself. It's better if you use real people, but imagine people will work for these kinds of stories as well. This is an example from a technical manual I created for a core infrastructure map in San Antonio, Texas, and it was to express to the next administration why this complicated infrastructure map will be useful to future generations. At our Famagusta pilot project, we've encoded 5 oral histories as a representative of 60 possible data samples to select for a diversity of backgrounds. In addition to demonstrating the common or conflicting themes of different neighborhoods all across the walled city, we discovered a distinct lack of locatable stories about the code labor. Upon closer review of the narratives that were shared with us, there were a few stories that were describable as happy stories. This reflected the stakeholders' selection, who were all of late to middle old age and would probably have been preteens or teenagers when the walled city was converted into a secured ghetto. The walled city may have represented a prison to these young people who were looking to escape and explore the world. So how do you go about proposing new narratives? Well, we do that by blending the ones that already exist. Whether you have a robust narrative infrastructure archive to draw on or just a few competing special interests, determining how to begin or telling a new story, the goal is not to be perfect and to tell a definitive story. The goal is to propose a possible story for the future, record benchmarks for each proposed story, and to assess it later to see which narratives are playing out and which ones are not. If a stakeholder complains their story is being left out of the story, invite them to contribute an oral history to make the local narrative infrastructure more robust, and then you can make a map of it. We can use these maps to accomplish both social justice and to facilitate development. The maps will highlight narrative conflicts, 2 stories that have different agendas for the same land, and help identify narrative allies, 2 stories that overlap and reinforce each other's themes. Areas that are lacking stories might indicate that a data sample problem has arisen, but genuinely abandoned areas will tell you that you need to weave new stories from the strands of the neighboring stories to encourage a locally derived new development. When stories highlight areas of blight, There you will need to compose stories of cleverness, not sacrifice or bravery, starting with the neighboring stories with more uplifted themes. Composing a story for the improvement of urban conditions is to change tragedy into comedy. A tragedy story has the characters competing one against another, zero-sum, a winner-take-all situation. A comedic story has the characters acknowledge their differences, join forces to beguile the larger problem that was the source of their contention. Everyone wants to be the heroes in their lives. This is part of living in a society. Those who sacrifice are lauded and taken care of by the tribe. This kind of story presumes a tragedy. No one wants to be a villain in a story, and a hero implies a villain. To label a party in a debate as a villain is polarizing and will create tragic drama. Most people don't want to be the fool, but a confederacy of fools, humble about their own limitations, can accomplish more together than one hero. The classical comedy is a group overcoming a macro threat or impediment. For example, the theme isn't to overcome racism, but the fear of other. The theme isn't to overcome developers, but to use development to evolve the local stories rather than displace them with alien ideas, profiteering, or short-termism. The finale of a comedy displays everyone's personal agendas as being subverted slightly to achieve an unexpected outcome where everyone does get something. Maybe not what they expected, but something meaningful to their lives. Exercise you might try for this. Examine television episodes, a book, or movie and think, what if this conflict happened at the same time, but the conflict was a different kind of story? Write that down. One paragraph for the setting, one for the actors, one for the conflict, and one for the new meaning. This exercise ingrains the skills of blending narratives into your communication style. I would also suggest that you enjoy the excellent classic Greek movie Never on Sunday, the story of a philosophy-obsessed American in the port of Paiatos, Greece, who tries to educate the most famous prostitute of Paiatos. She transposes the Greek tragedies into comedies. She overcomes the grand schemes of both philosopher and mob boss. And everyone goes to the seashore. In a quick case study, at Famagusta, a story was told of children playing marbles in this empty lot. The Turkish teller told how the Greek Cypriot children stood on the side of the lot and watched them play marbles, but were forbidden by their parents to play with the Turk Cypriot children. Given the demonstrated desire for more cafe space in the walled city, we proposed a simple new story. A cafe owner wants to open a new cafe in this spot and names it Losing Our Marbles Together. We took an economic need and combined it with a story and gave that story a comedic twist. The ultimate goal of incorporating narrative infrastructure in your planning is not to definitively tell a new story. Monomaniacal stories are a threat to communities and should be labeled as such whenever they arise. Truly beautiful cities that last for many generations are built from thousands and thousands of stories layered one on top of another. We are never done telling the story of a city, for when the story ends, entropy takes over. Most of us are working within legacy organizations with decades of accumulated decisions, infrastructure and deferred maintenance, interest groups, and upstream funding requirements. Inside each of these is a narrative you can use. So what are the big picture takeaways? Describe the character involved in the story. Describe the audience listening to the story. Describe yourself. Maintain a light-hearted approach or a light touch, and propose to turn tragedy into comedy. You do this by collecting and mapping stories. Compare those stories to your other maps and share them with the legislators, the public, and the developers. Thank you. Join me at the seashore in Famagusta at narrativeinfrastructure.org. And thank you to my sponsor, Alpha Terra Incorporated. If we run out of time, I will be available for more questions in a Zoom call immediately after this presentation. The link will be at the top of narrativeinfrastructure.org.